Up next on the Journal editorial report, it's the biggest spending increase since World War II. So what's buried in the so-called stimulus? And how will the ballooning budget deficit affect President Obama's agenda down the road? Plus, Wall Street bankers in the hot seat as Congress grills bailout recipients on perks and pay. But should government set CEO salaries? And Geithner's opening act. The markets tank as the Treasury Secretary unveils his financial rescue plan. The Journal editorial report begins right now. Joining the panel this week, Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, senior editorial page writer Colin Levy, Washington columnist Kim Strassel, and senior economics writer Steve Moore. Kim, let me go to you first. Everybody's talking about the spending, but there's some real policy changes that are going to mark a big change for government in this bill. What are the most important?
Well, if you run through, and this bill, people haven't even really read it all yet, but what has been tucked in here, as you say, are policy changes. Some of them, for instance, do with health care, designed to bring more people onto the federal health care system. Some of them have to do with the way health care technology works. There's also some provisions that, for instance, would water down the work requirements out in welfare, state welfare programs. And there's some things that have to do with changes, for instance, in education. So there's a lot tucked in there that has to do with policy, not spending. How about the spending, Steve?
This increase, where does it stand in terms of magnitudes? I mean, I remember in the Reagan years when spending as a share of the economy got up to about 23-24%. But this bill will take that spending level much higher than that, won't it?
Yeah, Paul, welcome to Sweden. We're moving to Sweden levels of spending here, with the spending as a share of GDP going up to as high as about 33% of GDP this year. You know, you asked the question, what's buried in this bill? One of the things that has infuriated a lot of the Republicans I've talked to, and some of the Blue Dog Democrats too, is a lot of them, even before the vote, they barely had time to read the bill. They were supposed to be given 48 hours. They had less than 24 hours. And, you know, that's just infuriating because there's so much. This is 700 pages. Most of the members who voted on this have never even seen what's in the bill.
But, Dan, this means a big change. I mean, this is a huge policy victory. Let's leave the vote aside and the difficulty that some of the Democrats had in getting some of the votes for it. Nonetheless, this is a big policy victory for a lot of liberal Democrats.
Well, it is a big policy victory. I mean, I don't think they quite knew how to get the number up to $800 billion of spending, so they put a lot of policy into it.
Cleaned out the cupboards.
They cleaned out the cupboards.
30 years of ideas, stuffed them in there and said, great.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, a lot of the president's formal agenda going into the presidency has been included in this bill, such as plug-in hybrids. There are billions for plug-in hybrids. Renewable and efficient cars, energy. There's $15 billion in there for renewable energy. And the healthcare data plan that Kim was talking about earlier, there's quite a few billions in there for that. So they have accomplished much of what they wanted to do in this.
Colin, let me ask you particularly about this welfare element, which hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but over the long term could be very significant.
Yeah, it's really a classic case of what's happening in this bill. You have a real reestablishment of a federal entitlement for welfare here. And
which was eliminated under Bill Clinton in 1996. A Democratic president signed the bill.
One of his huge legislative victories, something he often talks about, and this is something that's being undone.
Judging by the market's reaction, Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner's rollout this week of a new bank rescue plan was less than a smashing success. The Dow closed down nearly 5% Tuesday as investors criticized the plan, which could inject some $2 trillion into the shaky financial system, criticize it for its lack of details. We're back with Dan Henninger, Kim Strassel, and Colin Levy, and also joining the panel, assistant editorial page editor James Freeman. James, what's the most important thing we learned this week about the Obama-Geithner approach to the financial bailout?
Well, I think we learned that several years into this crisis, Mr. Geithner, who's been in the cockpit all along, still doesn't know what to do, but is convinced that lots of taxpayer money is the answer.
Well, let me give Tim Geithner credit for one thing, and James is going to dislike this, but a lot of the bankers were saying, give guarantees. Guarantee these bad assets on the books, and it would be great for them. Don't dilute shareholders as much, not as tough as the management. You don't have to work off those assets or record them as losses. He resisted that, and at least didn't put the taxpayers on the hook for that.
Yeah. But somebody has to be on the hook for those bad assets. The bad assets, the toxic assets, the damaged assets, they are at the center of this problem. And I think that's the way why the markets reacted the way they did. We've editorialized about this time after time, that you're going to have to go into those assets one after another and disassemble them. It's going to be a hard job, but they haven't given any detail on how they're going to do that.
Kim Strassel?
This gets into the question of this stress test, which was something that Geithner talked about this week. This idea that they're going to go in and take a really hard look at these top banks and what their balance sheets looks like. You know, the real question that people are still asking is, well, when you get done with that process, are you going to allow some of these banks to fail? Because there has been a lot of reluctance in the top echelons of government to actually let that happen so far. And that's got to be the question coming out of this stress test.
So, for example, Citibank, do you think, why have Citigroup, the government's already guaranteed something like $300 billion worth of potential losses at that bank. Is that one of the banks that there's some debate about whether or not it should be allowed to fail and shareholders wiped out? Kim?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the problems here too, Colin, is the specter of nationalization. I mean, if you do take over a bank like Citigroup, then the government's going to be the biggest shareholder, and that didn't work very well with AIG because that's been shredding value after that. And there's a real fear that government's going to end up owning a lot of the major banks in this country.
Absolutely, and you have to remember that this is a confidence game now. That's the biggest thing that happened this week in terms of the market's reaction to Geithner. And what you had was a failure by him to essentially sweep this back into the hands of the professionals. There's been so much politics involved now. I mean, it's much better off having it be in the hands of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, and the perception that politicians are running the show is part of the problem here.
Is dangerous, you mean, from Capitol Hill dictating certain terms,
yes,
and further putting a damper on private management. James?
Well, I just think Mr. Geithner is continuing his pattern of the last year, spreading fear and uncertainty.